Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 1. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel offered God a better sacrifice than his brother Cain did. And by faith he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith he still speaks even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land. Like a stranger in a foreign country, he lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to a city whose foundations, or a city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith Abraham, even though he was past age and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered himself faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Verse 13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people of Israel passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Verse 32, and what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign enemies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured and refused to be released, so that they may gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. And the world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, and in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they could be made perfect. Today, what I want to talk to you all about is living a life spent in pursuit of God. I want to talk to you about living a life spent in pursuit of God. When I talk about spent, anybody go Black Friday shopping in here? Wow, okay. Never mind. Black Friday Anonymous meeting after service in the gym. Okay, sorry. Didn't mean to say that. But no, we go Black Friday shopping. We get a lot of good deals on like Christmas items, and that's how I've always done it. But I'm not talking about spent as in, okay, I have $300 I'm willing to budget and spend for Black Friday for Christmas shopping. I'm talking about spent as in you are completely spent on something. It's when an athlete gives his all after a race and he's completely spent after the race. He has no energy, he can barely walk and just needs to crash. I'm talking about living a life spent in pursuit of God. The summer going into my senior year of high school, we used to hang almost daily. We used to hang out at our one friend's house. And I had a core group of friends from our youth group in our schools of about 7 guys. And our friend, he had a pool in his backyard, and he had an entertainment room in his basement. And so it was just a perfect spot. His parents were awesome. So we just used to hang out there almost daily during the summer going into my senior year. And about 3 of our friends had already graduated, and we were all pursuing God. We were the core students in the youth group. We were our youth pastor's leaders, and we were really pursuing God. But 3 of my friends left, and one of them, when they all came back, one of them was very changed, and he was the leader of our group. And he had gotten involved in alcohol and in doubting God, and this at a Bible college, okay? So don't think because you want to go to Bible college that everything's honky-dory, because it's not true. And yes, I just used honky-dory. I don't know why. Jesus help me. But 3 had graduated, 1 had come back, and he was very changed, and he was our ringleader. And in these days during the summer when we were hanging out, we came up with this idea of going away and doing like a man weekend. Right? We were going to go to the beach and we were just going to have a good time. We were going to chill. It was like that. It was like, let's get some freedom. You know, we're men now. And it sounded like an incredible weekend. It sounded like tons of fun, except there's this check inside my spirit. And you got to understand me, like a lot of the times if you get to know me now, I'm not the same person now that I was then. Okay, it may shock you, but doing something like this would have made me probably pass out before I really started pursuing my calling in ministry. And standing in front of people scared the living daylights out of me. And so I had grown up always being an outsider, and I learned very quickly how to manipulate myself and how to become anything to everybody and to be really fake. And I was able to be accepted because I didn't like being left out. And so in pursuit of being accepted, I changed who I was and did all that. But when I met Jesus, that all changed. Because my identity wasn't in what other people called me and what other people said about me. It was in who God called me to be and what he said about me. And there was this check in my spirit, and I had only been saved a couple years at that point. There was this check in my spirit that said, you need to not go on this weekend. And so I tried telling my friends, nah, this isn't going to be a great idea. I was trying to keep them to stay and keep them from going and having a good time without me, but they all decided, no, we're going. And so I was the only one that stayed. And when they all returned, it was like someone had placed a gag order on all of them. Nobody would say a word about what had happened. I'd joke around and be like, hey, how'd it go? They'd be like, oh, and then they would just walk away and they would leave it alone. And so one of the next times when we were all at our friend's house, everybody was avoiding the topic and everybody was acting like it never happened. And I went out and I sat by the pool. And I was just sitting at one of their tables there, and two of these guys came out, and they sat down, and we were kind of just chit-chatting, and then it went to, like, awkward silence. And out of nowhere, one of my friends spoke up, and he said something that is forever ingrained in my mind and in my heart. He asked me, how did you do it? How did you say no? And it struck me so profoundly. And listen, I'm not boasting in myself, okay? Because without Jesus, I wouldn't have been able to say no. I'd been messed up. I would not be where I'm standing today. But understand, when I'm talking and being confident, I'm confident because of what Jesus has done in my life. Okay, my testimony. But when he said those words, they're ingrained in my mind forever because. And I still don't know everything that went down. I could guess what happened that day. But they're ingrained in my mind forever because I realized an incredible spiritual truth that day. That the pursuit of God is worth every sacrifice that it demands. I mean it. The pursuit of God is worth everything and anything that it demands from us. Everything. Anything we pursue in life that's worth pursuing, it actually requires sacrifice. If you want to become an athlete, you don't just sit on the couch all day and popping potato chips and watching TV shows of other athletes competing. You don't just watch the Olympics and be like, hey, I'm going to be an Olympian, and then put in your application to be in the Olympics. That's not how it works. You sacrifice your time, you sacrifice your schedule, and you train, and you train, and you train until you become the athlete that you want to be. If you have any dreams in your life that you want to attain, you give up anything that will hinder you from reaching that dream in order to get to that place. If you want to be a doctor, you give up your social life. Maybe you went to college and you have an undergraduate degree and all your friends were good with that and they went into other careers and they're living a social life. They're buying cars, they're starting families. But if you want to be a doctor, you're giving up all your social life, you're giving up time, you're giving up energy so you can study and earn the title of doctor. And it's the same for so many things in our lives. If we have a family member who's experienced kidney failure, you will sacrifice your personal health and donate a kidney to save a life. When the Secret Service want to save the president, they don't just say, hey, bad guys, stop. Don't move. I see you waving that gun around. No, they jump in the way of the president sacrificing their life because his life they counted more worthy than theirs to survive. Do you understand what I'm saying? That anything in life that's worth pursuing, it requires sacrifice. And we spend our lives pursuing what we're passionate about, and we willingly will sacrifice in the name of our pursuits. But my question today is, where does God fall in the order of importance? Where is our pursuit of God? Because there's varying levels, but I'm talking about being spent in the pursuit of God. I want to talk to you about two of these people that we listed in Hebrews chapter 11. I want to talk to you about Abraham, and I want to talk to you about Moses quickly today. Genesis chapter 22, verses 6 through 10, tell the story of Abraham that Hebrews lists. It says this: Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and he took the knife to slay his son. Now, if you know the story, you know how the story ends. And I think that's a problem, because a lot of the times we'll read over Scripture with a glazed look in our eyes and with this understanding, well, it's all going to work out in the end. And we know the story. We've heard it 1,000 times. And if you've been in Sunday school, you saw it on the felt board. Like, everything went okay. But this is the problem. It's like reading a novel and then skipping to the end and finding out what happens. My wife and I, we were just watching a show the other day, and we were getting nervous because of this main character. It was like an action show, and we're like, oh my gosh, he's going to die. He's going to die. And then I'm like, he's the main character. There's no season if he dies. Everybody will walk out, and they'll never make another dime if this guy dies. And so it took away every suspenseful moment that they may face. And this is the same problem with how we read the Bible, is that sometimes we read it with understanding what the end is, but we don't read in the moment of what is taking place. Try to place yourself in Abraham's shoes if you can. Isaac is the son that God has promised to Abraham. They were barren. They were unable to have children. Abraham was afraid all of his possessions were going to go to a servant, and his name was just going to fall by the wayside, never to be remembered. And God comes to him and makes covenant with him and says, I'm going to give you a son. And you're going to have descendants, and everything that we had read before in Hebrews. This is the son that God had promised to Abraham. Isaac represented all of Abraham's dreams in his life. It was his legacy. It was the one that Abraham's relationship, his special relationship that only he out of all mankind had with God, it would pass to Isaac. Isaac's name meant laughter, and he was truly the joy of Abraham and Sarah's life. And he was the most precious part of this man Abraham's life. And now all of a sudden, God wants him to sacrifice Isaac. God wants him to kill him. In our Hebrews passage, verses 17 and 18, it says, he, Abraham, who had embraced the promises from God, was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. You promised, God. You promised me. You gave him to me, and now you want him back. What kind of a God is this? What if this was one of your children? If you don't have children, what if this was the person that you cared about most in life? What if this was someone that you had finally prayed, that you've been praying for, and they came into your life? Maybe this is someone who's been far from the Lord and they came to your life. Maybe this is a spouse that you've been waiting for and you've been keeping yourself pure for, and you've been working your life to protect your heart for so you could give it to them. And then all of a sudden God says, give them back. Sacrifice it. God gave them to you, but now he wants to kill them. And I know what my natural response would be. You're not my God any longer. I'm done with you. Because for you to ask me something like this, you must not really be God, and I don't have anything to worry about. That would be my natural response. But Abraham goes through with it. Then he reached out his hand and he took the knife to slay his son, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. The story ends well, but I still have a nagging little, I'm not happy with how it ended right there, just with how it, because it's like, oh, and they took the wood and they sacrificed and they walked down the mountain and everything was happy. But there's, as a dad, as a father to four very rowdy little boys, something is not settling right inside of me. Why was Abraham so willing to sacrifice Isaac? And make no mistake, Isaac is not this little kid, okay? It's like, Daddy, where's the lamb? It's not this little kid. He was a full-grown man, which another sermon completely entirely is the fact that a man allowed his father to wrap him up. Don't get me started. Okay. Why was Abraham so willing to go through with the sacrifice? It's because Abraham trusted God. And trust only comes through experience. When God was first making his covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15, the very first words he spoke to Abraham were this: "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your very great reward." Don't be afraid. I'm your shield and your very great reward. In other words, what God is saying to Abraham, Abraham, if you're willing to trust me, you have nothing to fear. Abraham, I know this life is not going to be easy. I know there's going to be challenges. I know there's going to be struggles. But Abraham, if you're willing to just pursue me, if you're willing just to trust me, you'll have nothing to fear for the rest of your life. The product of living a life of pursuit is the very presence of God. He is our shield. He's our protection. He's our defense. He's our reward. He is the end goal. The goal is not to get to heaven. The goal is to get to him. The goal is not heaven. The goal is the presence of God, to be with him for all eternity. He's our shield. He's our reward. Abraham's pursuit in his life caused him to leave his home, everything that he knew, to a place that God would show him. He allowed his nephew Lot to choose the best land available instead of choosing for himself the best land that was available. His relationship with God developed such compassion in him that he pleaded with God for grace towards two very sinful, wicked cities. He pursued 4 armies with 318 men to save his nephew Lot, which only based on an opportunity for God's name to become great in the land. And he believed God for a son to be born to his barren wife. And now he was standing before him on this altar today, Isaac. Abraham did all of this in the pursuit of God himself. And God is exactly who Abraham found. Let's read it. Genesis 22, 13 and 14. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horn. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." That phrase, the Lord will provide, that phrase is a name of God in the Hebrew. It's Jehovah Jireh. It's not just something that God does, but who he is. And so Abraham is on this mountain, and God reveals himself to Abraham, that he's a provider. He is the one who will always provide. And through sacrifice, Abraham pursued and experienced God. And when you pursue God, you learn to trust him. Why? Because Hebrews 11:19 says that Abraham reasoned, the reasoning for his sacrifice was that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. Abraham, in a very real sense, did sacrifice Isaac. It's true, the cold steel of the knife never met the warm flesh of his son's body, but he was so committed to pursuing God and to obedience to God that in his mind, Isaac was already dead. God commanded me. I don't understand it, but God has power to give. The Lord gives, the Lord takes. God is able and willing to do anything, and I'm able and willing to do anything for him. And so he goes through with it, what seems crazy to us. He lays Isaac down on the altar because of his intense, passionate pursuit for God. But receiving Isaac back, Isaac standing there next to him alive, is like a father embracing the son that he thought had died in war. It's someone that you thought was, I'm never going to see them again. And you get to that place where you just accept the fact. But then they come back from war and you're like, your whole world is shattered. This is what has happened with Abraham in this situation. Abraham passed Isaac from his hands into God's hands, and he took Isaac off the throne of his heart, and God was able to sit down. And Abraham learned an incredible secret of the kingdom. The pursuit of God has nothing to do with what lives, but everything to do with what dies. Has nothing to do with what lives, but what dies. Jesus, when he's talking about the cost of discipleship, to his disciples, he says, if you want to be my disciple, you'll carry your cross and follow me. But immediately after that, Jesus says this in John 12. He says, very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. In the kingdom, fruit is not found in what you sow, but in the death of what you sow. If a seed falls to the ground, but it does not die, it doesn't produce a harvest. Listen, you have dreams, you have goals, you have visions, you have things that you want and desires of your heart, but unless you yield it to God and allow it to die on the altar, it will never produce a harvest. In the kingdom, fruit comes from the death of the seed of what's sown, not from the life of what we sow. And when Jesus says you have to hate your life in this world, he's not talking about feelings of anger or hostility or depression. That word hate in their culture meant to love less. So what Jesus is saying, if anyone will love their life less than their love for me, that's where life is. On God's mountain, Abraham is proving that he loves God more. And God confirms this covenant relationship with Abraham. Genesis 22, he says, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. These are the original promises that God made to Abraham in the original covenant. He promised him a child, he promised him descendants, and that they would have a land, that they would take over the enemy cities and they would have the promised land. But now, interestingly, there's something new. And through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed. It's not just you're going to be your own nation, you're going to have a land. Because of your sacrifice, because of how you've trailblazed this way in faith, because of your pursuit of me, Abraham, and you've loved nothing more than me, because of your pursuit of me, all nations on earth will be blessed. And how are they blessed? Through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, a very descendant of Abraham. You see, Abraham went up the mountain to sacrifice the dream of a single nation, but he came down the mountain with the dream of a king of all the nations. He went up to sacrifice the one nation that his heart had latched onto, the promises of God, knowing that this is what God has given me. These are the desires of my heart. He went to sacrifice that one nation in his dreams and came down with the entire earth. When you sacrifice, God always brings life. When you sacrifice, God always restores to you what was more than what was sacrificed. And we're sitting around here complaining about all of the things that we don't have instead of saying, take it all and give me what you want me to have. Because his ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than my thoughts. And anything that I could come up with for my life, he has a better plan than anything I could possibly come up with on my own. But if Abraham was standing here today, because we can clap and it's good and we want to praise God and we want to be joyful and don't misunderstand my heart in this. I'm not trying to come down on us, but we can read this story just like I said before, and we can get caught up in the fairy tale ending. Right? We could get caught up in this is how it's going to end and everything's going to be good. But if Abraham was standing before you today and had the microphone instead of me, he would remind you that it came at a price. That something had to be laid on the altar, that something had to die. In the pursuit of God, the things that we love more than God must die, but that's not the only part of the journey. It's not the only part of the pursuit. You see, the pursuit of God also requires you to sacrifice your will. And Moses knew this sacrifice well. In Hebrews, in our passage, it says, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. There is a distant hope among the Israelites, passed down through the generations, a promise that was given to Abraham. It was the freedom of God's people. In that same initial covenant, God told Abraham, I'm going to give you a people, but they're going to be slaves for 400 years and mistreated by their oppressors. But I will be faithful and remember my covenant, and I will set them free. This was a promise that Abraham passed down through the generations. And when they found themselves in Egypt, grinding away at the mud and the hay to make brick and mortar, when they were doing that, this was the cry of their heart. This was the dream that every single Hebrew man and woman had, was that God is going to set us free. They all knew it, including Moses. And I would like to suggest today that Moses had a dream of a deliverer. Just like a boy or a girl will grow up to and dream of growing up to become something great. A boy looks at a soldier and pretends he's a soldier, or he looks at a superhero and wants to pretend that he's a superhero. We have this dream of becoming something. We have this dream of meeting them and experiencing them. I would like to suggest Moses had a dream deep down of Israel's deliverer. And his pursuit for God's will for that deliverer, for Israel, was enough to make him forsake the comfort of the palace and embrace the chains of his people. Exodus chapter 2 says, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? The man said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses feared and thought, what I did must have become known. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses had fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. In a moment of pure opportunity, Moses tries to be the deliverer that he longed for, the deliverer that he was born to be but did not yet know. And he failed miserably. And this is the problem that we see with both Moses and Abraham, and that we experience in our lives, is when we try to take our dreams and our visions and we try to take God's will into our hands, we end up living in the wilderness and producing Ishmaels instead of Isaacs. But what we need to do is to trust God and to allow him to have his way in our lives. Moses spent 40 years living in the wilderness, 40 years of a decaying dream, 40 years of a dying desire. And half the time we can't make it through a year. We can't make it through high school. We can't make it through college without feeling like, God, like, what the heck is going on, man? 40 years of a decaying dream. I can imagine all the thoughts that are going on in his head. Maybe I wasn't strong enough. Maybe I wasn't well-spoken enough. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe this was never me. And all these doubts and all these lies that come from the enemy. And it's this constant breaking down. And he spent 40 years breaking, 40 years in brokenness, not as a deliverer, but as a shepherd, leading sheep instead of a people. But he never for 1 minute stopped his pursuit of God. Verse 27 of Hebrews 11, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. What do you have in your vision today? What do you have before your eyes today? What are you pursuing? Are you just the horse chasing after the carrot, right? The carrot and the stick? Or are you pursuing God's goal, God's destiny for your life? Why was Moses so confident? He fixed his eyes on his Creator, and he was passionately pursuing the faithful one. And his pursuit led him into God's very presence like no one had ever experienced before. So during this season, Moses laid aside the deliverer and became the shepherd. He yielded. He came to a place where he was so frustrated holding on to the deliverer that he finally let go and he embraced the shepherd. And it was in that moment that he encountered the burning bush. It was in that moment he encountered the burning bush. See, shadows, there were always shadows of a deliverer. The deliverer never left inside, but his will had been yielded to God. Moses delivered Midian women from harassing men, and he spent 40 years delivering sheep from predators. He still was devoted to freedom. Just because you have to lay a dream down doesn't mean you can't still be passionate about a dream. But it's about yielding our will. Listen, before we came here, we were approved U.S., okay? But for God's will to be accomplished in our life, I had to lay that down on the altar. And I still hate human trafficking with everything within me. I fight against it. I still pray against it. But it is not who I am because I followed God's will for my life. Sometimes you have to lay down your will and sacrifice a dream. This was how Moses watched 40 years of his life pass away, day after day believing in God, day after day sacrificing his will, until that one famous day where he came face to face with the burning bush. God encountered God himself, or Moses encountered God himself. Exodus chapter 3, the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. This is the moment that Moses is waiting for, but Moses' response reflects no excitement whatsoever. In fact, this is not the man who killed an Egyptian oppressor, right? This is not the man who killed an Egyptian slave driver. This is Moses, the broken shepherd. This is his response. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God told him exactly who he was. God said, I will be with you. That's all you need to know. Now that you're broken, now that you don't have some idea in your head of how your life's going to work out, now that you don't have some idea in your head of how you're going to do everything in your own strength instead of by my will, now that you've done that, now the only thing you need to know about your life is that I will be with you. Needed to hear, and in this moment after Moses had finally given up and sacrificed his will and dream, at that moment, Moses found God. Moses sacrificed and God revealed himself to him. See, the reward of sacrifice is God. And these are not isolated flukes of history. Hebrews 11, all the men and women in there, the Bible said that the world was not worthy of them. Man, the world was not worthy of it. You read through it and you're like, wow, what a terrible life. And then you read, the world was not worthy of them? They went around in sheepskins and goatskins and fur, and they were wanderers. They had no home. They lived in caves and in mountains, and they were persecuted, and they were oppressed. And what a terrible life to live. The world was not worthy of them. The world was not worthy of such people. Is the world worthy of me? All these men and women, they pursued God through incredible sacrifice. Abel, he gave the best of his labor and wealth, and he found favor with God. Enoch, who was the son of Cain, who murdered his brother Abel, he sacrificed his infamous family legacy of rage and murder, and he walked with God. Noah sacrificed his reputation, and he became the heir of righteousness. Abraham sacrificed his will, comfort, and stability, and he received covenant from God that changed the world, that changed each and every one of your lives in this room today. Isaac sacrificed his children's future, and he saw a deceptive, manipulative child become a servant of God. Jacob sacrificed his life in the promised land, and he received instead a nation that could receive the promised land. Joseph sacrificed his God-given dreams, and in return, God gave him the opportunity to save the world. He won the heart of a pagan king, and he saw all of his dreams fulfilled. Moses sacrificed status and he became face to face with God. The Israelites sacrificed all caution and conventional wisdom and they received freedom from oppression. Joshua sacrificed acceptable military strategy that made sense, and by following God's will saw the walls of Jericho fall. Rahab sacrificed her life devoted to the culture that surrounded her, and she was inserted into the very bloodline of Jesus Christ. You see, I happen to read the Bible, and I don't see stagnant people. I read the Bible, and I don't see men and women who are truly pursuing God, who are just comfortable sitting down and not doing anything about it. I see radical men and women of God who counted themselves worthy to be persecuted for the sake of Christ. Hebrews 11 talks about how there were men and women to leave, refused to leave the torturer, people. The world was not worthy of those kind of people. The pursuit of God comes with a price, but the reward is God himself. Listen, you may be laid down Isaac on an altar because that's what God wants you to do. He may ask you to sacrifice. You may be struggling in your life wherever you're at right now. Feel like you're wandering through the wilderness and struggling in the wilderness to survive and to make ends meet and to go through all the motions and just to keep your eyes on God. But if you keep going, there's a burning bush right around the corner, a few steps down the road. Don't give up the pursuit of God before it's time. Don't give up the pursuit of God before you reach your goal. Don't run a race in vain. Run it to the end. Run it the whole way through. You may be struggling, but God's about to reveal himself. There's a preacher who said the minimum requirement for you to get to heaven is the blood of Jesus. But the minimum requirement for you to manifest the kingdom is your life. So what's standing in your way from getting to God? What's standing in your way from experiencing God? They didn't hear about the resurrection. They were walking along defeated and thinking that this was the end. And with Jesus, resurrected Jesus, comes up and walks with them, and they tell him about everything that's and sat down to eat at night. That when Jesus prayed over the food, he disappeared in the blink of an eye, and their eyes were opened, and they realized who it was. But it wasn't just at that moment that there was a sense that this guy was something different. The one disciple spoke up, "Did not our hearts burn within us as he was speaking to us?" Did not our hearts burn within us as he uttered his words at the sound of his voice? Did not our hearts start to burn and to burn away everything that was not? Did not our hearts start to burn with holy fire and passion at the sound of his voice? We've embraced the lie that we can be Christian and still live a normal life. We've embraced this lie that we can live a normal life and still be Christians when there's nothing normal about a Savior dying and resurrecting for the sake of the world. Listen, there's some weird stuff in the Bible, but it's all true. It's all true. And the resurrection of the body, the resurrection of the dead, it's all true. We are not called just to get to heaven. We're called to be in the presence of God so that we can be resurrected and walk this earth one more time. Imagine with me, if you will, losing a loved one who loved Jesus to cancer. And one day in the future, that loved one is going to be standing in the same place that they got a cancer diagnosis. But they're going to be living inside the presence of God in a resurrected body where there's no sickness, no pain, no struggle. Imagine what it's like sitting at your table, looking over the bills, and not knowing how this is going to work out and being so depressed, making enough money in life. And then for one day to sit at that same table and to visit that. That's the power of the resurrection. That's the hope that we all look for, but it only comes from passionate pursuit and living a life of sacrifice going after God. Christians were called followers of the way. Whenever you read way in the Bible, it just means path or road. But they were followers of what road? The road that Jesus laid out for them. And where did Jesus lead us? To God. So when they call them followers of the way, it's not just people who followed a set of codes and rules that Jesus set up. It's a people who passionately pursued and sacrificed everything in the sake of getting a hold of God. in the sake of getting hold of the presence of God. That's what it means to be a Christian. And I'm not saying you need to sell everything that you have and go crazy and do that. If God's telling you, go do it. But I'm not a week. Certainly we can sacrifice a couple hours of Facebook. Certainly that's just stuff that is in the way of us getting to God. And can I just be real honest with you too? If you're new in the Lord and you're a baby Christian, that's fine. And there's a lot of things that we learn, and none of us start off really good spiritually with the Lord. We have to learn and grow and sacrifice things along the way. But so getting rid of addictions and filth that we entertain ourselves with, that's like kind of basic step stuff. Okay, but if you are really want to pursue God with everything that you have, this also means from time to time, God may ask you to lay down a blessing that he gave to you. And that's hard, and nobody wants to hear that. So you got to lay down dreams and sacrifice them and let them be dead to you in order for God to reign. Them is not about what you sow. It's about the death of what sows. Pursuit of God is God always restores. You cannot outgive God. I really struggle reading the Bible and comparing myself to it, because I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. I look and I see, okay, this is the standard of the Bible. This is where I want to be. And I beat myself up for not meeting that. But I look at the Bible and I'm inspired when I read Hebrews 11. I'm inspired when I read the book of Acts. And I see these men and women of the early church and the passion that they had for God, the pursuit that they went after with God. I mean, men and women through history who have sacrificed, who have been willingly tortured, who laid their lives down, missionaries who used to pack up all their belongings inside of a coffin and go to their country because they had no intention of returning. Men and women who were tortured for the sake of Christ and refused to leave their torturers so that they could spread the gospel in those prisons. Men and women who sold themselves into slavery just so they could get into a closed country. I read stories like this in history, and I read Acts, and I read Hebrews, and I wonder, where is this passion in our day and age? Where is this passion in my life? Where are the men and women who are willing to lay their lives down? Why do we end up fighting over pews and songs and sound levels and traditions instead of fighting over, which area of the city should we win over first? Well, I really like South York. Well, I really like West York. Well, I really like East York. Well, I think we should be right in the heart of the city. We fight over what that person said to me and how that person offended me. We fight over pointless things that are more about the world than about God. Why does the world do more about its own fire? We haven't come to that burning bush. We haven't laid down. We're still holding on to everything that we want. We're still holding on to our will. We're still holding on to our dreams instead of living a life completely yielded to God, completely sacrificially given over to God. We live our lives void of the fire. Put it on the altar. Listen, I'm not mad at the church. I love the church, but I love the church enough to tell you guys and to tell anywhere I go in the future, okay? I love this church enough to tell you guys that we're missing it. We are living in a world, in a generation, in a time where we are missing it. And there's movements of God going on. Don't get me wrong. There are things that are happening, but for the opportunity to engage is ritualistic, and we do the same thing every week. And I'm not these testimony things that are in your seats. I've seen testimonies of cancer being healed. I've seen people who walk up crippled running circles around sanctuaries. I've seen people who have been dead come back to life. Okay, I know that God is moving on the earth, but it's only in a select few, because there's only a few who are willing to let their hearts burn for Jesus and to give everything over and let him have his way. That doesn't mean you sell your house and you go live in India. It could mean that, but it doesn't mean that necessarily. But what it does mean is that, God, whatever you want from my life, I'm willing. You gave me this brand new position. You gave me better pay. You gave me my child, car that I always wanted. I just got married and I have the white picket fence that I always wanted for you. And so if the cost, I lay my life down for you, God. Pastor Darren, if you'd come. You're enough for all of us. Oh, God, we're so often missing it. We're so often missing the point, God. We get consumed with things that are good and that are nice, God, and that you have no problem with, God, except for the fact that they sit on the throne of our hearts sometimes instead of you. And we live our lives holding on to our will, and we live our lives holding on to our dreams instead of laying them down. Church, the word says that God will give us the desires of our heart. The problem with that is that he's not going to give you something that's going to hurt you, because he's a good father. He will give you the desires of your heart. So how does that happen? When I lay down my life and my will, and I get closer to him, and I spend my life in pursuit of him and him alone, I start to become more like him. And my heart starts to beat closer to his heartbeat. And my thoughts start to align more with his thoughts. And the closer I get to him, the more I get a hold of him, the more of God I get in my life, the more passionately I pursue him. And the more I sacrifice along the way, my thoughts start to match his thoughts, my heartbeat starts to match his heartbeat, and my desire, my dreams, and my will start to match the desires, the dreams, and his will that he has for my life. And if you think for 1 second that you could come up with something better for your life than God, your creator, who knit you together in your mother's womb, who breathed the breath of life into your lungs, who sustains you even now, every breath you've taken this service was directly sourced from the Father. If you think that you have any clue what's good for your life opposed to him, you are dead wrong. And that is not saying we can't have dreams and desires. But what I am saying is lay it down. Abraham wanted a son, and he got the nations of the earth. He prepared the way of salvation so that all of us could be sitting here today. What could happen if for one moment you trusted God? When he said, Abraham, don't touch your son, don't touch your child, don't slay Isaac, because I'm telling you, don't do it, because I know now that you fear the Lord, because you've sacrificed, you haven't withheld him from me, you've laid him down. You love nothing more than me. I know that you fear the Lord. That term, fear the Lord, doesn't mean to be afraid of God. What it means is to have complete trust and belief in God and who he is and what he says, that he's completely true. That's what it means to fear the Lord. That's what it means. It's not just respect. It means, God, I'm pursuing you no matter what, because I trust you and I believe in you. And based on those things, Abraham laid Isaac down on the altar, not knowing the outcome, but knowing who God was. And so what do you have in your life? Whether it's the junk and the mess that Pastor Danny was speaking about before, or whether it's even the good stuff that you need to just get rid of because you're not following the voice of God anymore, because you're not following his will for your life. You need to lay it down and sacrifice it, because there's no life without sacrifice. We were dead in our sin until a perfect lamb was sacrificed when Jesus laid his life down. And then, only then, do we have new life. And that's a principle of the kingdom. Anything you sacrifice, God will, for God's sake, for the pursuit of God, God will bring life to you in an incredible new way that you could never have imagined before. You could never imagine before. So the altar call is simply this today. If you are hungry for a burning passion for God, which I pray is every person in this room today, but if you're hungry for a passionate pursuit of God, for encountering him in ways that you've never believed could happen before, if you want such a powerful encounter with God and you want to pursue him, I'm going to ask that you would come down to these altars.